How do everybody? I've just been watching a video by Academic Agent. He's a very good channel, by the way, and I do highly suggest watching him. In fact, I'll link the video down below. And he's been asking lately quite a lot. He's been exploring the war in Ukraine and why is Britain and Europe so hell bent on getting into the war. And he seems to be stumped. And I've been thinking about it myself, and I think what a lot of people seem to be, you've got a lot of people coming out with various ideas like, oh, he's playing good cop, bad cop, or it's saber rattling, whatever. There's lots and lots of different reasons, but none of them seem to make much sense. And for myself, I think what's actually happening is we're seeing raw politics in action. Now, in the past, we've obviously seen where politicians will say loads of things, but none of them actually mean what they say, and actually they're making deals behind closed doors and all that stuff, and it's been for the public. But as we've seen with Ukraine lately, politicians aren't messing around anymore. Things are getting very, very serious, and I genuinely mean that now. The good times are over. Politicians are getting very, very, very twitchy, and they're trying to find what it means to actually be a leader again. Now, obviously, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are playing that game exceptionally well, whether you like them or not. They are playing strongman politics. Like when Vladimir Putin said he was going into Ukraine, people didn't believe him, and he went into Ukraine. And when he said he was going to do what he was going to do, he's gone and done it, and he's not messed about, and he's used some pretty hefty pieces of equipment in that war. And he's been warning about it for a long time. I don't really want to get into that side of it. But what I think this has done is this has caught Europe on the back foot, because Europe has been riding, including the UK, where I live, have been riding on the coattails of America for far too many years, and they've been playing too many petty courtyard politics type games at the expense of things like national defence and realpolitik, I believe would be the phrase. So what we're seeing now, where we're seeing like Keir Starmer insanely committing to war in Russia and saying he's going to send thousands of troops over there. I mean, that in and of itself ain't going to happen, because in order to send 5,000 troops somewhere on a mission, you're looking at like a 2-year cycle. You got 1 year which is a rest and recuperation year, and another year which is a training and deployment year, and that's kind of how the cycle works. But in order to do that, you need to have 4 units all constantly overlapping. So you'll have, say, year 1, first half of that year, Unit A will be deployed. They will then spend the second half of year 2 at year 1 and the first half of year 2 on rest and recuperation. And then they will then go back onto pre-deployment training 6 months in advance of deploying again. That's not exactly how it works. That's a rough example. But in order to have, you've got to think of the 2 years as having four quarters. So think of 2 years as being 1 unit, if you will, 1 deployment period. And in order to cover all 4 quarters, you need 4 units at different stages. So 5,000 men very quickly becomes 20,000 men, which are required to fill that gap of a deployment. So we don't have that. Basically, we've got an army of about 76,000 people. So we would be needing to commit nearly half of our entire armed forces just to cover a 5,000 man deployment in Ukraine. So for that reason alone, we ain't going to be doing it. But even with that in mind, I mean, that's not really what I was after talking about anyway. I mean, what I'm more thinking about is European politicians, including in the UK, are becoming increasingly irrelevant. We've now seen the AfD go to 20% as an example. We're seeing the rise of reform in the UK. They're looking over at America, seeing Donald Trump. The world is changing. It's changing quick. And a lot of these old parties are becoming increasingly irrelevant in a world that's no longer based on the rules-based order of the 20th century, which came into effect after World War II. And a good way of trying to understand what I think they're doing is to look at quite a recent war for Britain, which was the Falklands War. Now, people can go into all the politics of the Falklands War like they want, but basically what the Falklands War was a war of survival for two political parties in 2 different countries. You had the Argentinian premier at the time, who was doing terribly in his own country. He had a lot of civil unrest, and he was basically looking for an excuse to try and unify his country and try and get a bit of nationalist fervour back in the country. The best way for him to do that was to invade the Falklands. And weirdly, at the same time, Margaret Thatcher, who was in charge of the United Kingdom, she was facing electoral destruction. She was definitely she was going to just be a one-time prime minister, and the Falklands basically landed in her lap, and it was like the golden goose opportunity for her to save her career as prime minister and cement herself in the history books, which she did very well, very successfully. But if the Falklands War hadn't have happened, Margaret Thatcher would have been gone. She was brown bread, she was toast at that point. So the Falklands War wasn't really about the Falklands War. It was more about political egos trying to keep themselves relevant and save their own bacon, so to speak. When you boil it down to it anyway, everything else is just bluster and BS beyond that. But we've also got issues with like the economies in Europe. They are absolutely failing and faltering. The European continent itself has been stagnant for decades now. There's no innovation going on there. Everything's stifled by legislation. We've also got these ideas in the EU like free movement. Since Angela Merkel allowed basically the entire world to move to Europe, they've kind of got themselves stuck into a corner as well, where they can't back down from it, because if they do, they admit that everything they've done is wrong. And again, they'd face political oblivion. So another thing that I think these European leaders are doing is they are going to use war in Ukraine as a reset for them to be able to change tack on a lot of the policies that they hold dear to the heart at the moment, but they desperately want to get rid of, because they know they are going to face political destruction if they don't. So again, these parties, I think, are seeing war as a way of creating nationalist fervour within Europe, trying to unify their own base and allow them to make exceptions to the rules that they can't normally make exceptions to, and possibly even do things like, say, return migration of lots of people under the guise of national security. There's also, I think, and this is a really big part of it as well, is I do think that Keir Starmer and the EU are going to use this to try and centralise power in Europe. It will be an excuse for them to try and bring in a centralised European army if they start doing poorly in a war with Russia, which they probably most likely will do. I mean, if they go on and win against Russia, which I don't think they would do, then it doesn't matter, they've not lost anything, and if anything, they've gained everything that there is to gain from Ukraine and what they would view as removing Putin or whatever it is that happens at the end of that. But if they start to lose, the EU can then take advantage of that and then can override nation states and further consolidate control of the assets that those states have under the umbrella of a federalised EU system. And I do believe as well that Keir Starmer would try and use a war with Russia and bring in an emergency power to try and drag the UK back into Europe as well. And I do think that's part of what the EU want as well. And I think that's a really, really big point that everybody's missing, is that this would be an incredibly perfect situation for them to say we have to take the UK back into the EU as a matter of national security, to fight against Russia. And that, I think, is the piece of the jigsaw that everybody else seems to be missing from that. Just a few thoughts I've had floating around in my head with it. I do think there's definitely something in there, what I'm saying, and definitely some of that people who are far smarter than me and with access to far more information should definitely start looking into and maybe picking out a little bit deeper than what I'm able to go to. But I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for your time. Take care. If you've enjoyed listening to what I've said, please like, subscribe, and definitely please do put comments below. I love reading them. I love replying to them. I don't always get back to straight away, but I always do try to get back to people as quick as I can. Thank you very much. Take care and goodbye.